Jeff Tumlin, a principal at transportation planning firm Nelson Nygaard, and author of Sustainable Transportation, Tools for Creating Healthy, Vibrant, and Resilient Communities, is as good as it gets when in talking about what constitutes state-of-the-art 21st century transportation. And by the way, the book is on sale over here. I think Jeff likes that plug. David Dixon, one of our leading transportation and urban design planners in this region, said that what makes Jeff so good and so widely admired is his fundamental commitment to transportation as a powerful tool for making communities more livable, equitable, environmentally responsible, and competitive for jobs and investment. This is why we are doing this series, to better understand what is happening around the world and what are the models that we can use to build better communities. As Jeff was talking, as we were getting to know each other just before this, Jeff is working on projects in Moscow, Saskatchewan, and as well as Abu Dhabi. So you can't think of any more wide-ranging environments to be dealing with. Last month, our three speakers provided a wonderful foundation for Jeff to build on. Robert Puentes of the Brookings Institute led off with a talk focused on how America and Boston will need to invest in transportation that connects people to jobs and education and makes our export economy, both goods and expertise, more competitive in a global knowledge economy if we want to maintain the relatively high standard of living enjoyed by many Americans and begin to chip away at the generational poverty that is becoming more solidified as with each passing decade. And this will actually be a key focus of our next conversation in December. Stephanie Pollack, Associate Director at the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern, followed by describing the real and increasingly urgent challenges that Boston's aging transit system faces in serving our rapidly evolving population and economy. Finally, Beverly Scott, MBTA General Manager, confirmed Rob and Stephanie's messages with a rousing call that with a rousing call that reminded us that she and we know the problems. Our challenge is the hard work of changing our political culture so that we can make the hard decisions and develop the kinds of public and private funding strategies we need to build the 21st century transportation system. At this point, I want to take just a moment to thank the Barr Foundation for their support in this program and the Green Ribbon Commission for their work in addressing the needs of this city, who have helped support this program. I also want to ask that everyone, there's a sign-in sheet that will be going around, and this helps us understand how you found out about this and hopefully spread the word for the future programs that will be coming up. And finally, as a quick reminder, please turn off any of your ringers and the electrical devices that you may have. In the words of Beverly Scott, this program is about the it ain't the it. We are not here to talk about strictly transportation, but we are really here to talk about how to create the kinds of infrastructure systems that will be needed to make a difference in people's lives. So let's hear from Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Jeff Tumlin, and though I live now in the Boston of the West Coast, also known as San Francisco, I, like my mother, was born in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, you know, there's a lot of mythology around Los Angeles, and one of the greatest myths about Los Angeles is its love affair with the automobile. That is, by the way, my mother, and that is her real hair, and yes, she made that dress herself. And like most little boys anywhere, I had a fixation with trains and really with all forms of transportation. I also watched a lot of television. And one of the things that TV taught me early on was that someday buying a private automobile was going to be the thing that would bring me social status and autonomy and power and, well, kind of much later on, but most importantly, right, sex, right? This was what the automobile commercials were telling me. And, I watched, how many thousands of these things did I watch growing up in Los Angeles in the 1970s? In fact, we've been sold this vision of automobiles transforming our lives for a very, very long time in the United States, really everywhere in the United States, not just in Los Angeles. And where a lot of this image of the automobile comes from, where it is rooted, is the Futurama exhibit of the 1933, 39, and 64 World's Fairs. These were industrial exhibits sponsored by General Motors. And they were the most visited industrial exhibits in the history of the world. In 1933, 1/3 of the population of the United States, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1/3 of the population of the United States showed up at the 1933 World's Fair, and almost everyone who visited came to the Futurama exhibit. And what did it promise us? Well, it promised us deliverance from the miserable life that so many Americans were experiencing in the Great Depression, and it promised us a vision of our lives transformed, a life where mobility would deliver us endless opportunity and freedom, a life where mobility would make anything possible, not only a fantastic economy and a fantastic quality of life, but also personal transformation. Our cars would make us better people. And this exhibit promised us both a chicken in every pot and, of course, a General Motors car in every garage. And I don't know if there has ever been a better, more seductively presented vision of the future of cities than what General Motors did for us starting in 1933. In fact, even today, if you ask a child today to draw a picture of her vision of the city of the future, most likely she is going to reference a 1962 Hanna-Barbera cartoon, The Jetsons, which still dominates our image of what the city of the future is going to be like. And of course, The Jetsons is, it's a celebration of independent mobility and all sorts of fantastic modes of transportation that sort of deliver us from what were becoming clear were some of the drawbacks of the automobile. In fact, in 1955, when Disneyland opened, one of the most important and influential and popular rides of the time was the Autopia ride, which remains popular to this day, which basically predicted, this came before the interstate freeway system, and basically trained young Americans about the thrill of driving through cloverleaf interchanges. Disney has tried to get rid of this ride because of their fear of Tomorrowland, where this ride is based, and actually, true confession time, where I worked when I was in high school. Disney is terrified that Tomorrowland, which was built in 1955 to promote this ecstatic vision of the future, has devolved into a sort of kitschy yesterday land, that even the diabolical geniuses of Disneyland remain trapped by this 1933 vision of what our cities of the future should be like, and particularly the central role of automobile and automobile-like devices in delivering us our future selves. And so is it any wonder that when we think about all that these exhibits and that television commercials have been promising us over the decades, is it any wonder that we are just a little bit disappointed, perhaps a tad irritated, in fact, maybe have a little bit of road rage when we are confronted by the reality of driving, by the reality of the cities that the automobile has delivered us, which is so very different than what we were promised. In fact, if there's anything that we learn about our American experience with the automobile, I would say it is the law of unintended consequences. The automobile is fantastic. I got my driver's license on the day of my 16th birthday. I saved all of my money from my strange jobs and bought a car, it was actually the day after my 17th birthday, and I've owned a car ever since. I love driving. But I also recognize that my love of driving has consequences. one of the consequences that happily the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta has been tracking over the last couple of decades is the obesity trends throughout the United States. And they have conveniently mapped it for all of us on their websites. They've been tracking this since about 1985. This is a little color-coded map showing the percentage of adults in different states that are clinically obese. And the sort of the medium blue here is, 10 to 14% of adults, in Upper Ohio Valley and parts of the Deep South in 1985, 86, 87, 8, 9, 1990. 1991, we have to change the scale. 92, 3, 4, 5, 96. 97, we change the scale again. Now up to a quarter of adults clinically obese in the upper Mississippi drainage. 1999. 2001, we change the scale again, over a quarter in Mississippi. 2002, 3, 4, 2005, change the scale again, over a third of adults in Mississippi and Louisiana. 6, 7, 8, 9, and the trends continue. This is a dramatic change in American culture, in our social and public health costs, in the cost of our own personal life and our own personal mobility. This rate of obesity coming at a time when we're seemingly getting everything that we want as a society, in part because of the ubiquity of automobile ownership. Now, we recognize that correlation is not causation, but we find it fascinating that the growth, the curve of increasing obesity rates in the United States track almost perfectly with rates of driving and rates of automobile ownership. We also find that there are other factors at play. One of those factors has to do with our own social needs. Human beings, we are fundamentally social primates, and our brain chemistry is very, very complicated. Among the whole array of interesting chemicals that our brains release is one of my favorites. It's called oxytocin. It's a very complicated neuropeptide. It looks like that. It's released from the pituitary gland, and it is effectively the biological basis of trust. Oxytocin is this neuropeptide that tells us that if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That we're all in this together, and that things are going to work out just fine. And it is released under very specific circumstances, and it's so powerful, in fact, that you can order it on the internet, basically as a kind of date spray. We don't really know how effective it is, but it's released in part as a date spray because it's released under very specific circumstances. One of the ways that it's released is when we stare longingly into the eyes of our beloved. So you're having a bad day. You come home. You see your honey. You look that person in the eye, and suddenly, everything is better. We've had this experience. It is released, of course, most prominently with orgasm and with breastfeeding. We hopefully have also had that experience. But it is also released very interestingly with outdoor exercise. And we've also had this experience. If you have a terrible argument with your coworkers or with your spouse, everything looks bad and grim, you're a nasty, horrible person. You go outside, you go for a brisk run or a brisk walk or a bike ride outdoors, you're out there for 20 minutes, suddenly your head clears. This is not psychology happening. This is brain chemistry. This is your body, your brain specifically, releasing an array of hormones and neuropeptides that tells your mind to calm down and to have a different sort of perspective. And it's released kind of in all of us and in relatively small amounts. And one of the great things about oxytocin is that unlike dopamine and the other opiate chemicals where we get a rush of pleasure, Oxytocin, there's no downside to it. You don't have the crash that you get from the sort of the opiate high that our brains produce. It sort of builds upon itself. It ties us together with our tribe, and particularly those people that we love, and it builds upon itself, and it helps us to create stronger bonds of trust. On the other hand, we're also learning from the neuroscientists around the world that being trapped in our cars has a different sort of impact on our brain chemistry. So as social primates, we're incredibly skilled at being able to handle really intense social situations. You can walk down the most crowded sidewalk in Manhattan and not run into anyone, even though you don't have blinkers on your belt. Because we're constantly sending social signals to each other about status, about where we're going, about our attitudes. There's a little flirtation. There's, if you do actually bump into somebody, you can kind of, sort of turn slightly, shrug your shoulders a little bit, and, off you go. All of the richness of our social experience that we have happen in a room like this, or out on the street, or with our families, that can happen in a verbal or a nonverbal way. All of that social stimulus that our brains are very, very finely attuned to, when you put us in the glass and metal carapace of an automobile, all of those signals get shut down. So you're driving along the highway at 65 miles an hour, and some guy comes around, cuts you off, right? What happens, right? Your heart rate sort of increases a little bit, and you get a little puffed up a little bit. Yeah, things start racing. You tense maybe a bit. And then you expect a reaction, apology. You get nothing. You're like, dude, what the heck are you doing? You get nothing. And it ramps itself up again. Now, this guy may not have had any idea that he just cut you off, may not have seen that at all, or he may be frantically trying to apologize to you, but can't, get that through to you at 65 miles an hour with the noise and speed and distance of driving an automobile. And so the amygdala, the most primitive center of the brain, where our fight or flight responses originate, gets triggered because this person has threatened both our life and our social status, the two things the primitive mind cares most about. And it's getting no apology in return. It really, really freaks us out. And so the amygdala sends out this array of chemicals basically designed to help us, fend off a saber-toothed tiger, right? So our muscles all tense, you get in the crouch position, you bulk up, you're ready to fight or run. And very importantly, the cerebral cortex, the more modern part of the brain, shuts down. Now, this is the part of the brain that allows us to think through the consequences of our actions. If you're fighting with a saber-toothed tiger, you don't have time to think through the consequences of your actions. You need to react. And so the amygdala brain is the reactive brain. And this is the brain that we use when we're stuck in horrible traffic congestion. Now, this is bad enough, but as the amygdala fires regularly, what we find, or what the neuroscientists find, who I'm fascinated to read about, is that it causes permanent changes to the structure of the brain. It makes us more prone to anger, more reactive, less capable of thinking through the consequences of our actions, less trustful, more unhappy. And of course, all of this, we don't even need to talk about how the relationship between being stuck in our cars leads to lives devoid of physical activity, or where physical activity becomes a drudgery that we force ourselves to do by driving to the gym rather than simply doing as a course of our daily lives. And so when we know from the health records, from the social science records, from the mental health records, from the human happiness records, that excessive driving, being forced to drive under miserable circumstances every day, makes us more angry, more mistrustful, more obese, more prone to cardiovascular disease, to heart disease, to lung disease, to a whole variety of other nasty conditions. Excessive driving basically makes us deeply unhappy, Whereas daily outdoor exercise makes us more loving, more trustful, happier, healthier, fitter. Everything's great. We wonder why, in the transportation world, every single design requirement, measurement of success, and code and guideline is fixated on this rather than that or that. So when I travel around the country and the world, part of what I do is look into the DNA of communities and see whether the lofty policy statements about, walkability and mixed use and transit orientation and sustainability and so on, whether those policy statements are in alignment with the actual codes and regulations and requirements of those cities. And I can assure you that in every single city that I've worked in, including this one, they are not. They are in direct contradiction with the goals and objectives of every place that I've worked. And they require that stuff like this still get built, even though every community they've worked in has said they don't really so much want this anymore. And in fact, their street design requirements and regulations and performance metrics say that this is success. And indeed, it is success. It's fantastic. Look, you've got, there's a mix of uses. There's, some residential and some employment and services and all the needs of daily life. And, it's context sensitive. Look, there's landscaping and there's sidewalks. It's, and it's, level of service A. And look, there's even a pedestrian in the crosswalk. See, this is a complete street in a mixed use, wonderful neighborhood, because this is what we require our traffic engineers to build, despite the fact that our policy objectives say something else. And so we wonder why our poor citizens and our poor traffic engineers are driven crazy by this rather stark mixed message between what we say that we want to do and then what we require that our cities do. So this lecture is about 7 things that you all can do here in Boston in order to get your goals and your vision in alignment with your codes and regulations and guidelines. And the first step, and probably the most important, is to measure what matters. So how many of you are familiar with level of service, or LOS? Okay, good, or most of you. All right, so for those of you who didn't raise your hand, level of service is, it's a very simplistic score that the transportation industry uses in order to measure whether a street, quote, works or not. And it is, it's graded on an A to F scale, just like your kid's elementary school report card, with A being really good, you got an A, that's great, and F, of course, being complete failure. And not only has your street failed, but you as a transportation professional have also failed. And so what level of service says is it basically measures the seconds of delay that an average motor vehicle would experience at a typical intersection, sometimes in the peak 15-minute period, sometimes in the peak 1 hour. It's measured in different ways. But it basically says that if there is congestion, you've failed. And this is bad, and you need to add another lane. So it's one of the reasons why here in San Francisco, we built things like the Embarcadero Freeway, cutting our city off from the waterfront, just as you cut your city off from the waterfront, in order to improve intersection level of service. Level of service, though, also says that a street that is full of people and shoppers and cars and commerce, a street with exceedingly high property values, that's really bad. So a street that's at capacity, that is thriving, is a bad result. You never want that. Always much better to have an empty street. That's what we strive for in the world of level of service. And so from a traffic engineer's perspective, the crowded, successful place where lots and lots of people are spending money, that's really bad. The empty, deserted place, that's really good. That's success. Of course, if you had a different perspective, for example, if you were thinking about this as an economist, you would say that that crowded street, that is crowded only in its peak 1 hour, is perfect, because you have built exactly the right amount of infrastructure for the demand. Supply and demand are in balance. That's what happens with congestion. So congestion is really best seen in economic terms. It is simply where the demand for transportation services comes into balance with the supply of transportation that has been provided. And that's a whole other lecture about why taking an engineer's approach to congestion management will never work. For an economist, the empty street is not only generating no revenue, but you've also built a lot more infrastructure than is needed to serve the actual demand. Another big problem with excessive emphasis on level of service is that the pursuit of level of service as a means of eliminating congestion only exacerbates your congestion problem. And there are a variety of reasons why this works, but the most important one is what we call induced demand. So how many of you like being stuck in congestion? No one? Okay, well, all right. I've never heard that before, but no, so actually, of course, we all hate being stuck in congestion, and it makes us very unhappy, and we complain to our city council and to our traffic engineers, and we say, you know, you need to widen this roadway in order to eliminate the congestion. And that makes us happy because now we can drive faster. So we can drive faster, but now we make different decisions. So that fantastic lunch place across town that I read about that seemed so fantastic, but that I wouldn't have gone to before because it took too long to get across town. Now suddenly you're like, hey, you want to try that? Or more importantly, honey, now that they built the new freeway, why don't we move to the bigger house farther away? Because we can still drive to our jobs in town just as quickly as from our smaller, older house closer in. So of course, if you make driving faster, people make different decisions. So more people drive, which then results in more congestion, which makes people sad, and they complain. And so the roadway gets widened, and the cycle goes on, in part because of induced demand, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because in this pursuit of ever wider roadways, we make it that much more difficult for anyone to walk or bike or take transit. If we widen the road, it's that much more difficult to get across the street. And if we widen the road at the expense of a great sidewalk, you've just made a street that basically no one except people who have no other choice are going to walk there. And so the pursuit of level of service as a means of eliminating traffic congestion becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're predicting a rate of driving and you provide roadway facilities to accommodate that rate of driving, you've just made that rate of driving happen. If you provide less facility, people make a different set of decisions, and property value changes accordingly, and the economy works so that congestion is effectively not the variable, but the constant. The reason we widen roadways is not to eliminate congestion. It's to create real estate value in places that would otherwise be inaccessible to the automobile. There are very good reasons for widening roadways, but eliminating congestion is never one of them. How many of you have been promised that a roadway widening project would finally solve the congestion problem? Like, we've all heard this. Many of us have voted for measures that promised congestion relief. How many of those projects actually delivered the congestion relief that was promised? Well, maybe for the first 6 months, if that. In fact, the Surface Transportation Policy Project has pointed out to us that even for those projects that delivered 6 months of congestion relief, they generated more than that much delay during their construction period. Roadway widening only worsens congestion. It's good for changing real estate value. Another problem that we're running into as well is the way our tools greatly overestimate how much driving is expected. So most of the analytical tools that we use in our industry were kind of developed in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And during that period of time, there was effectively a straight line increase in per capita rates of driving and auto ownership. And we thought that this was good, and it was necessary to provide for. Over the last decade, however, things have changed rather dramatically, and our analytical tools have not caught up. One of the things that has changed dramatically is the rate at which young people are getting driver's licenses. A third fewer young people these days are getting a driver's license than they did back in the 1980s. That is a big deal. We don't know yet whether that trend is going to continue. But we do know that the attitudes that young people have about driving are dramatically different than those of my generation. I was a part of the last generation that truly believed that my automobile was going to bring me social status and freedom and autonomy and sex. Today, the thing that delivers those to young people is not their automobile, but this device, right? The automobile is the thing that gets in the way of their being able to use this device. And so what we're finding, remarkably, is a rather dramatic difference of experience in public transportation, with public transportation being a way that young people can stay connected and be sociable while being mobile at the same time. It's really rather remarkable. And so at a national level, when we look at the rates of driving per capita throughout the United States, we see a remarkable peak in about 2005, with a steep drop-off since then. In fact, that drop has continued. Actually, no, this is the more recent chart. So far in this economic recovery, clearly some of this drop in driving is related to the recession and the disproportionate impact the recession had on younger adults. We're still not seeing the uptick that we would have expected given the rate of recovery that we've seen. And we're suspecting that some of this dramatic reduction in per capita rates of driving is not just based on the economy, but based on a significant change in attitudes. So getting back to this topic of what do we measure? I would argue that if transportation investments really do almost nothing to one way or the other in terms of impacting congestion, that we need to focus on what they really can achieve. And so the first thing that I do when I'm working in any community is ask that community, what are your values and priorities? What's important to you? What do you care about? And how can the transportation system support all of those things do you care about? And support you not just in terms of mobility, but in terms of your economic vitality goals, your social equity goals, your ecological restoration, whatever it is that you care about. The transportation system is there as a support activity in order to help you deliver the community that you want to be. And so if you start looking at transportation not just as mobility and, God forbid, not just as congestion relief, but as a way of delivering great communities, you can suddenly ask very different questions. So one thing that many communities have found is that something as simple as trees in the public right-of-way are not only delightful, they not only make people happy, but they have a demonstrable impact on property value. How should the transportation investments support your local property values? And then what does that say about our attitude about something like street trees, which most traffic engineers in my industry think of as fixed hazardous objects, but an economist would look at as something that is adding to both residential quality of life and directly to property values. The City of New York, their DOT under Jeanette Sadekhan, has done a tremendous job in their book, Measuring the Street, in actually going through methodically and looking at how the various interventions that they've done over the last 8 years of the Bloomberg administration have impacted not just congestion, but other things that people care about. Injury crashes, commercial vacancies, whether people like it or not. And so these relatively modest street reinventions that the New York City DOT has done have resulted in spectacular benefits, many of them having to do not with mobility, but with local retail success and local quality of life. Including wiping out on-street parking spaces in front of commercial buildings in order to install sidewalk seating. 14% increase in sales at the businesses fronting that. In San Francisco, we're getting up to 33% increases in sales when we remove parking spaces and put in public seating. And that occurs not only at the businesses where the outdoor seating is placed in front of, but in the district as a whole. Because what attracts people to a retail district? Is it the Starbucks? Is it the nail salon? No, it's other people. We're social primates, and displaying people in the public realm, in the parking lane, does more than almost anything that we can do in order to attract shopper interest to the district as a whole. So measuring success, perhaps the most important, but also the wonkiest thing that you can do, and requires you to be very, very clear about exactly what it is that you want the transportation system to do. Point number 2, put the needs of daily life within walking distance and make walking delightful. So in the transportation industry, we really fixate on the commute trip, in part because we've got a lot of data about the commute trip and not much data about the other 80% of trips that households make. Our commute trips, about 20% of typical trips, and declining, actually, as younger people are making increasingly more trips to do all sorts of different odd things. We've got remarkably little data about exactly what people are doing on those trips because it's pretty chaotic. And so it's hard for us as engineers to kind of figure out what to do with this 80% of travel. But one thing that we know anecdotally and sort of in aggregate from the places where the needs of daily life are within walking distance is that you end up with tremendous benefits. So you end up not only with more people walking and the public health impacts of that, but also better property values because people actually like to walk. We are social primates. We are these bipedal creatures of the savannah. Our bodies are designed to be physically and socially optimized when we're walking and on foot. And it's important that we not just think about the basic mechanics of walkability, but also the quality of that experience. If our goal is to make a healthier society or a less carbon-dependent society or a more economically successful society, then we need to make walking not just barely functional, but compelling, seductive, and delightful. And I would argue that we need to do the same thing for bicycling. The bicycle is by far the most efficient mode of transportation ever invented. And it is unlikely that this basically late 19th century invention is going to be much improved upon. We're getting, basic, a little bit of innovation here or there around the margins. But the fact that the human body is able to convert its its biomechanical energy so efficiently into forward momentum and mobility. There's not much more that we can do to improve upon the equation. But when we start thinking about biking, it is critically important that we not just think about the 35-year-old men in Lycra. Biking needs to be a safe and comfortable mode for the full array of people of all ages and abilities from 8 to 80. What we find when cities start investing in bicycling for that whole array of human beings is dramatic rates of increase in cycling. Portland, Oregon, which has been at this for a while and is, pretty lame by European standards or even by Canadian standards to some degree, but has still been able to get an immense increase in rates of cycling, has also found that the best thing that any city can do to improve safety for cycling is to increase the number of cyclists. And so while one could have an interesting debate about the actual inherent safety of cycle tracks, side paths, and other more innovative bike design treatments, the fact is that those facilities are necessary to get more people cycling, and as a result of more people cycling and making cycling more visible to motorists, safety improves for all users. And so that gold bar going down there is the rate of cyclist injuries in Portland, Oregon. So if we look at who's currently cycling in most cities, and I would add Boston kind of in this category over here, where there's the kind of the 1%, 35-year-old white men with Lycra who are strong and fearless and who will put up with whatever roadway conditions, no matter how horrible. And then there's another sort of 5 to 10% of us, and I'm probably in this category, that's enthused and confident and that will put up with sort of crappy bike lanes and bike lanes that sort of come and go randomly, as all of you have experienced here. The market that we really need to chase is this big one that is interested and concerned. What New York has found, what San Francisco has found, what Portland has found, and what Boston is increasingly finding is that when you go after that market and you create a consistent, interconnected network of separated cycle tracks and neighborhood greenways that are strongly traffic calmed, that people of all stripes actually really like biking if they're provided a safe and delightful and comfortable place. And then, of course, there's another 20 to 30% that are just not at all interested, and they're fine. But by getting the sort of the 60% who are interested out of their cars and onto bikes, that 20 to 30% who's not interested clearly benefits. Not only because cycling is incredibly energy efficient, but also because it is incredibly space efficient. In any growing city, the problem with automobiles is not about ideology, but rather about geometry. Automobiles take up an immense amount of space. I need 10 times as much space per person to move somebody in a car than to move them in any other mode of transportation. And so in order to make it possible for people to be able to drive when they need to, it is essential in cities that we make it delightful to walk or bike or take transit for everyone else, particularly in a city that wants economic growth. And this is about the sheer geometry of cars. If you're increasing the number of cars in your city, you're decreasing the number of people that the transportation system can move. You're reducing the capacity of the network because of the space and efficiency of the automobile. And again, in New York, not only do we find that we can increase the capacity of 8th and 9th Avenue in New York and get a huge increase in the number of cyclists there, but lo and behold, people on bikes spend more locally. Because why? It's so easy to park and stop and shop locally, right? No need to drive to the big box out of town, not going to do that. No need to worry about finding a parking space. Local retailers love cycling. Point number 4, make transit fast, frequent, and reliable, but most importantly, dignified, and really, I would add, sociable. The French are really the masters of this. So this is Montpellier, but it could be Strasbourg, it could be Marseille, it could be Lyon, and it could be a tram, or it could be a bus. But this is a typical French bus. What do you see? It's low floor. You can roll a wheelchair or a walker or a stroller right off the curb and onto this vehicle. It's beautiful and well maintained, but it's also completely transparent. Floor to ceiling glass, clear glass. When two of these are stacked up against each other, you can see through both of them to the storefront on the other side of the street. Not only can you see through them into the storefront on the other side of the street, you can check out that person who happens to be flirting with you while you're walking on the sidewalk and go to the next stop and get on and carry on the conversation. The French recognize that the fundamental economic foundation of great cities is flirtation, and that transit needs to accommodate that. That transit needs to accommodate our social needs as social primates and celebrate the pageantry, the experience that we all love when we come to any great city and walk around and get dressed up and kind of check people out and get checked out. There's nothing more thrilling to us, and that gives us a greater sense of personal well-being and having our social status confirmed than being flirted with. I used to believe a long time ago that the actuality of sex was kind of at the economic foundation of cities, but I've since realized as I've gotten older that no, actually flirtation is fundamentally more important. It is not a means to an end, but truly an end in itself in terms of our social well-being. And indeed, when you invest in these things, you get real results. If you provide quality, people are attracted to it, you can get a big increase in ridership. This is a really, really crappy implementation in New York, but even there, they were able to get a significant increase in ridership and an even bigger increase in retail sales, because people who ride the bus also are pedestrians who take advantage of local services. Point number 5, and this is a particularly good one for Boston because you're ahead of almost every place else, which is to adopt the right street design manual. Here in the United States, we're, I think, unique among nations in that we have delegated national authority for street design standards to a private nonprofit organization called AASHTO, or the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. They added the transportation later. It used to just be the highway engineers from the state departments of transportation, and it kind of still is, even though they've changed their name. So they own the American street design standards. And they're a great bunch of guys, and I say guys not being sexist because I think they all are. Are the best highway engineers in the world. And their standards have been adopted in countries around the world because they have resulted in extraordinarily safe rural highways. Now, that's fantastic. I would point out, however, that the same design techniques that make our rural highways and our freeways so safe are the opposite of the design techniques that make urban streets safe. Namely, rural highways are made safe by accommodating the inattentive driver. Everything in our standards has extra wiggle room built in for, in case you doze off, or you've had a few too many to drink, or you're swatting your kids in the back and are sort of swerving around. All of those sort of shoulders and extra wide lanes and sweeping curves and clear sight lines, all of that makes highway driving safer. When you apply those techniques in an urban context, however, it actually supports inattentive driving. So driving is a dangerous activity. And when you make driving seem safer than it actually is, it becomes, in fact, more dangerous. And so urban driving is made safer by narrower travel lanes, by tighter corners, by more enclosed visual space, by planting street trees, and most importantly, by slowing traffic down and designing for slow traffic rather than having to post speed cameras and do after-the-fact intervention in order to get traffic to slow down. So many cities have recognized this problem, in part because they collect data that the state departments of transportation don't, because they only control the state highways, not the urban streets. And Boston has been a leader in this regard with your whole Complete Streets project and your Boston Complete Streets design guidelines that came out, or just earlier this year. Really fantastic set of guidelines. Lots of other cities are also exploring other approaches to design. And one of the great things about this year is that the National Association of City Transportation Officials just released a sort of compendium set of design guidelines called the Urban Street Design Guide that learns from places like Boston and San Francisco, Portland, Indianapolis, New York, other cities, in order to be able to deliver streets that are not only safer, but also more beautiful and more economically successful, because we care about these things in city streets. So it is very important here in Boston that you take advantage of the fantastic work that you've done and continue learning from your neighbors and innovating and using best practices. And you're doing all this. Keep it up. Do it faster. It's great. Point number 6, second to the end, probably my favorite topic, is you gotta be smart about parking. Parking is one of those topics where the most cognitive dissonance in the transportation industry kicks in. So it's also where my Orange County, California libertarian clients who think that the free market should rule everything and that government should have no involvement in private affairs, when they they interfere in the private development market in order to force developers to oversupply specific goods and to make sure that those goods are provided to the public for free. My libertarian clients become Soviet communists on the topic of parking. And it's fun kind of teasing them about this. So again, let's imagine that transportation is better seen as a branch of economics than a branch of civil engineering. and posit that the reason we charge for parking is to make sure that there's adequate parking availability for commercial businesses, for employees, for shoppers, for people to find a parking space on their street. The right price for parking, then, like the right price for any other good or commodity in our society, the right price for parking is the lowest price at which a few spaces are still always available. The right price for parking is always the lowest price that meets a modest availability target. This is the same price that we set for housing for people, for food, for clothing, for our utilities, but generally speaking, not for parking because we're Soviet communists when it comes to the topic of parking. So now, it's all well and good to believe that. It's quite another thing to go out into community, particularly to a bunch of merchants, and say, hey, it makes good, market economic sense to charge for parking. They will tell you that you are evil incarnate and that you're a money-grubbing evil bastard. So in order to have this conversation, you need to start with a couple of ideas. One of them is you need smart parking meters. Most cities, actually I don't even know what kind of parking meters you're using here in Boston, but many of my clients are using parking meters from the 1930s, right, that require coins. Like anyone has coins on their person. And so the first thing that you need to do when you start charging for parking is to take parking meters that accept forms of payment that people actually have in their person. The reason you're charging for parking is to make a more successful commercial district. If any of your merchants in your commercial district required payment in quarters, they would quickly go out of business. So take credit cards. Also, all meters today will call you on your cell phone and ask if you want more time. So the most important thing to do is to start with a customer service attitude about parking, because that's the reason we're providing parking management in any event. So don't use 1930s technology. This stuff is cheap. Get rid of any meter that only takes coins. Secondly, it is always cheaper to use technology in order to help motorists find empty parking spaces than it is to build new parking spaces. Here in Boston, building a new parking space, probably $35,000 to $75,000 a space, like all told, higher. Yeah, that's a lot of money. There's a ton of empty parking throughout central Boston and throughout all of your neighborhoods, but motorists don't know how to find it. So we now have technology that you can put sensors in parking spaces, particularly in the more hidden, tucked away ones, in order to direct motorists to find the nearest available space. Lots of cities are doing this. It's a lot cheaper than building new parking. It also means that if you've accepted the fact that the reason we charge for parking is to create availability, that the price of parking is going to vary tremendously by geography. Prices on Main Street need to be higher than prices 2 blocks away. Prices on the street are going to be 2, 3, 4 times higher than prices in the creepy parking garage off the street. Accept this, it's okay, it's necessary and good. This is little tiny Redwood City, California, which has, a 3-block commercial district. They recognized that the price of parking on their main street needed to be, well, in fact, infinitely higher than the price of parking 2 blocks away, where they were able to make it free because that was the market clearing price for their underutilized garage. It also means that if the goal of parking pricing is to create availability, that if you have an evening restaurant and entertainment district, that shutting off your parking meters at 5 p.m. is stupid and counterproductive. This is Pasadena, California, near Los Angeles, city of LA, where a lot of parking is free and unmanaged. Pasadena realized we're going to compete against Los Angeles by attracting people here at night. We need to kick out the employees who are parking in front of the bars and restaurants. They charge for parking until midnight on Friday and Saturday because that is what was necessary in order to make sure that customers could always find a space. Now, this also means that no matter how smart you are about good, principled management of parking, Your citizens and your merchants and many of your customers will continue to accuse you of being evil, money-grubbing bastards. And so you also need to be very clear about what you do with your parking meter revenue. Again, this is Pasadena. 100% of the net meter revenue goes straight to the Downtown Business Improvement District, which uses it as play money. They steam clean the sidewalks every night in Pasadena with their parking meter revenue. Other cities, it goes, like in San Francisco, our parking meter revenue goes to run the transit system. Other cities use it to fund capital improvements like traffic calming, street upgrades, and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to dedicate it, but you need to communicate with the people who are being charged what is happening to their money, that it's not just going, to government, right? So what else? Other critical points. The price of parking must be unbundled from the price of housing. You should never force families to buy more or less parking than they want. Why would you want to increase the cost of housing and increase the rate of driving at the same time? Celebrate families who have fewer than an average rate of cars, and also accommodate families who have more than the average rates of cars. Separate the price of housing from the price of parking, and encourage sharing. Do you have on-street car share here yet for Zipcar? You do? Okay. Very good. Every car share vehicle that you put out there in the street eliminates between 7 and 25 private vehicles. Car share is awesome. It provides spectacular mobility for people when they need it while reducing the rate of driving and rates of auto ownership. So sort of pulling this all together, there are different approaches to parking that result in dramatically different outcomes. So this is, I don't know your streets here, some suburban strip arterial, every city has them, you know what your local ones are. And the street has different land uses arrayed along it. So you've got school and a park and employment and shopping. And of course the zoning code requires that each of these uses has its own parking, right? And if the rate of parking that's required is more than 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, then you're requiring more space for cars than you're requiring space for people. So imagine a typical trip, and this is, much, constrained, compacted. But so you drive your daughter Sally to school, and that requires a parking space in front of the school. You drop her off, she goes to school, then you go to work. You have to go at your lunch break to pick her up and take her across the street to go to soccer practice because she can't walk across this horrible arterial. And then you go and you do some shopping, and then you pick up Sally and you go home. And this is like, many people's kind of daily life patterns. And in addition to it being a spaghetti of traffic, it's also a lot of turning movements off of the major arterial, each of which is putting a disproportionate impact on congestion. So imagine that same arterial, but you have a nice grid of streets, and you array your land uses oriented to actual streets and sidewalks rather than to the big highway. And you have those land uses share parking because you notice, the peak parking demand for shopping is at a different time of day than the peak parking demand for employment. And so you can share some parking, and now you've saved some money so you can afford to put that parking into structure. And you have exactly the same trip. So you drive your daughter to school, and you park the car, and now she walks herself to school and can take herself to soccer practice because she doesn't have to get across the arterial. You can pick up your shopping during your lunch break, and then you can meet at the car, and you can go home. And this is the exact same trip as the previous one, but dramatically different results just because of a slightly different way in which we've arranged these same land uses and parking, which results in half of the parking, less than half of the land area, or twice as much economic development capacity per acre, about a quarter of the arterial trips, a sixth of the arterial turning movements, and less than a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled, or 4 times as much economic activity per vehicle trip as in the previous scenario. So we wonder again, why our codes and our regulations still prejudice us towards the previous scenario rather than this scenario, given our attitude for the automobile. So coming back to my original proposition, that our country has a problem, that we are stuck in a 1933 vision of our cities and the role of mobility in creating our cities and the role of mobility in creating our best selves. Your challenge, and I don't know what the answer to this is. It's something that we all need to find together. But your challenge is to come up with a better vision for the city of the future. And one that is rooted in not a sort of mistaken belief that this consumer product is going to deliver us, but rooted in our own psychology, our own sense of appreciation, our own love for each other, and our own belief that this is an amazing city and a spectacular country. I would say that if we are going to craft a more compelling vision of the city of the future, that one of the conditions that it must be rooted in is a very simple concept, and one that the modernists rejected as sentimental. And that concept is very simple. It's beauty. And beauty, they say, is in the eye of the beholder. But coming back to neuroscience, we find that, as was well studied in ancient Greece and in Buddhism and in Taoism in China and in Shinto in Japan, that there are certain fundamental characteristics of beauty that our brains universally crave. And just as the sort of happiness that oxytocin delivers to us is lasting and does not diminish, the appreciation that we have for beauty we never tire of, and that is merely our brain chemistry at work. And so one of the most fundamental aspects of sustainability, I would argue, is not reducing BTUs or CO2, but investing in beauty, because our brains never tire of beauty, and our brains strive to protect beauty. We as humans will work to maintain things that are beautiful. I would argue that if a thing is not beautiful, it is inherently unsustainable, because the things that we maintain are always more sustainable and more green and require less energy and produce less CO2 than new things that we have to build. We all know that the leaky old buildings in old established neighborhoods, restoring those neighborhoods and continuing to inhabit and invest in them is always more sustainable and greener than the greenest new development that we could possibly imagine. So I would challenge you to figure out for yourselves what you find beautiful and deeply satisfying, and to make sure that those values are reflected in your vision of the city of the future, and that your city has a way of quantifying, capturing that, so that all of our codes and guidelines and regulations point us towards a city that we will all love. Thank you. I'd be happy to.
Some time for questions?
Questions? Oops, let me hand you this microphone.
I'm just about to start a project in Buffalo, New York, and I'm just waiting for that comment about snow and how they need more space for snow. Do you have any suggestions for the colder climates that have to deal with pushing around the white stuff?
So I'm a California boy. So I don't have a lot of personal experience with snow. In fact, my mother, when I was 12, realized that I had never seen snow before, and she put me on a bus up to Big Bear. And I guess hoped that I would find my way home, which I did. But I saw snow, and it was very alien to me, and it still has a certain alien quality. Nonetheless, in my client work, I do have to deal with a lot of cities that have heavy snow loads, including places like Moscow, that has an immense amount of snow that it has to contend with, as well as a lot of my Canadian clients. So, so snow is it's facilitated by having some space in the street for dealing with it. So, conditions like medians become really useful. The parking lane, of course, becomes useful. Also, parks and plazas, places that you can basically push the snow to until you can have trucks haul it away. Lots of different techniques. And so, looking at best practices, particularly from some of the most constrained cities that have really, really heavy snow loads. In Moscow, we've been particularly inspired by Stockholm and especially Oslo, that have very, very heavy snowfall and super constrained streets. Also recognizing, just like with street trees, that throwing labor at snow removal has a clear cost, but so does having overly wide, unsafe, and unattractive streets. And so snow removal is another one of these topics where you end up with really bad results if you over-professionalize. So just as you never want your fire chiefs to be the only consideration for street design, so do you not want only your snow removal people to be your only consideration for street design. But you want to make sure that if you place greater cost burden on your snow removal people, that somehow, they're basically paid back. So you'll need to demonstrate that the net tax revenue off of a really, really fantastic, intimate, really super pedestrian-friendly street is enough to be able to generate, make up for the added cost of snow removal.
I spent a month in Berlin this summer. I haven't been there in the winter, but the bicycle traffic in Berlin was absolutely amazing. I understand it's even better in Amsterdam, and I don't know what you're finding in Moscow. But
Work in progress.
my son, who's moved to Berlin, says people are bicycling summer and winter. So maybe it would be a good idea if we're, looking at transportation planning or bicycle planning in cities that have snow, that we look to a European model and figure out how they do it.
Absolutely. So we've learned a lot. So the city that probably has the most interesting story about rapidly increasing rates of cycling is Copenhagen. So a lot has been written about the Copenhagen experience, and there's teams of designers from Copenhagen who'll come here and tell you how it's done. What's great about the Copenhagen experience is they have really lousy weather in Copenhagen. And in the 1970s, they had kind of no one riding bikes, and most of their city center was choked with cars. And they started making a conscious and very incremental decision just to slowly start reallocating space towards cycling and providing dedicated bike facilities, experimented around a lot with the finest design details, and basically nailed it on design. So that, when I'm in Copenhagen, it doesn't make sense for me to take transit when I'm in Copenhagen, because a bike is always a more convenient choice. And everyone is out biking. People are biking in the rain, people are biking in the freezing cold, because it's more convenient and more delightful. And considering the better natural advantages that Boston has compared to many of the European capitals. I mean, all of the European capitals would kill for the available street rights of way that we have in any American city, including Boston. You're more constrained than others, but still lots of street space. Making a conscious decision to focus on making the street system move more people means, mathematically, you need to invest in the bike as a convenient and exceedingly space-efficient form of personal mobility. It's also, the other thing that I love about the bike is that as consumer preferences change. So there's a great concern in the real estate industry that we have in most regions in the United States as much auto-dependent single-family home fabric as the market will ever demand. That demand for that product, it's still strong, but it's dropping as both aging baby boomers and young people are increasingly demanding a more walkable, more urban kind of housing. The bicycle will be the salvation of automobile-dependent suburbia because it provides the necessary, it fills the necessary gap for being able to connect to transit and to connect to local services for people who are not interested in driving. And automobile-dependent suburbia, because of its hyperabundance of street rights-of-way, is the most easily retrofitted in order to accommodate the bicycle graciously.
Transportation has historically meant impervious paving. Have you got any thoughts on permeable paving or variations of it, and what does that do? How do you integrate that in so we're not destroying the water cycle in the process of making all of this work? Of course, if you reduce the amount of the number of lanes and the width of the lanes and all that, that helps because you're using less space. But just what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the most important thing that we can do for dealing with stormwater runoff from impervious surfaces is to make our cities more compact. So if you look at impervious surface on a per capita basis, which is the best way to look at it, urbanism is the best solution to our stormwater runoff problem. Another really useful thing to look at is not only the pavement down on the ground, but the pavement up in the sky, namely rooftops. But then, of course, you do want to look at to what degree can we make the pavement on the ground connect best to the water systems underneath the ground. And recognize, just like with snow removal, permeable pavement has a cost. There's an initial increase in capital cost. There's also can be a significant increase in maintenance. So oftentimes cities will start not just with the pavement that the cars and the buses are driving on, but the pavement that the lighter vehicles, the bikes and the pedestrians are working on. And will use low impact design in order to the extent that there is impermeable surface, to channel that runoff into rain gardens and so on. So there's a lot that we can do that is relatively low cost and in fact maybe even more effective over the long run than simply trying to switch everything to permeable surfaces. So I would argue, look at all of the surfaces and come up with the least cost solutions, but focus on urbanism as the best thing that we can do. Other questions? In the back.
So I agree with everything you said about parking. What I don't understand is how you ever convince, like, the new mayor of Boston to change anything about. We still have 1930s parking meters that you put quarters in, and it took the city about a decade to increase the cost from 4 quarters for an hour to 5 quarters for an hour.
Yeah.
We give away on-street residential parking permits for free. So we have, I think, about 1 for every 2 registered vehicles in the city. And the mayor specifically said during the recent election that he would not charge for those because he didn't think it was fair. So if you had 2 minutes to talk to our new mayor, how would you convince him to do something about parking?
So taking on parking is probably the most difficult topic that any elected official can ever take on. I would rather take on homelessness or crime or prostitution. There are any number of things that are a lot easier to have a grown-up conversation about than parking. Typically with parking, what I like to start the conversation in a very narrow way. So oftentimes the leadership about not being stupid about parking actually arises out of a retail district, so out of a business association, who need space for their customers. And recognize that parking is outrageously expensive, and simply trying to build your way out of the problem doesn't solve the problem any better than trying to build your way out of congestion. So what I would do is not talk directly to the mayor, but to find the savviest representative of the business community and sit down with those people and say, we got to get smarter about parking. Let's come up with a plan. Because the mayor is going to be much more likely to listen to a representative of a business organization than, you know, some random citizen or environmentalist or, you know, citizen do-gooder type, right? You know, got to be pro-business. So I'd start there. And then, you know, the argument is basically, well, I mean, it's much of what I just presented, but it's focusing on the cost of not doing anything, of simply being delusional about the problem. That we need to recognize that parking is just a commodity like any other, that providing it for free, it's like having a government mandate that provides ice cream for free. And, you know, if we provided free ice cream to everyone, we would quickly notice that our childhood obesity problem would be greatly exacerbated, and you know, there'd be a cheese shortage, and we'd be, you know, paving over subdivisions to, or, you know, digging up subdivisions in order to have more dairy lots. And, you know, people would start pointing out that maybe this free ice cream program wasn't such a good idea after all. But then, you know, you would have people screaming, well, what about the children? You know, ice cream makes children happy. You're going to make children unhappy. So that was way more than 2 minutes, but that's what I would do. Other questions?
In a way, you've advocated congestion pricing for parking, but you stayed away from the idea of congestion pricing for streets. And I'm just wondering if it's part of the toolbox, but it's even more impossible than parking, or if there's a reason to not think about it at all.
Well, so if you actually wanted to be rational about transportation, you would recognize that we have limited tools for bringing supply and demand into balance for any good. You can use pricing, which we use for food and clothing and shelter and our utilities and so on. You can use fiat. You can decide that certain classes of individuals can have this good and certain classes of individuals cannot. Or you can use the standing in line approach. So you can either price a good with money or with time. For a variety of reasons, and I think it's most challenging here in the United States because of the way that we conflate our freedom of movement, this sort of fundamental constitutional notion of freedom of mobility, with the actual freeness, the lack of price of mobility. Those are linked in our heads, and so it becomes very difficult here in the United States to have a rational conversation about whether we should be paying for transportation with our time or with our money. People have a hard time recognizing that as a choice. So very consciously in San Francisco, where we have gone through both a congestion pricing study as well as a parking pricing study, we've concluded very clearly, and after a pretty darn grown-up conversation with the business community, that whether you price the trip itself or the trip end, you can get similar behavioral results. And that while there are certain aspects of congestion that we're not going to be able to control through parking pricing in San Francisco, we can make a really big dent in it through establishing the right price for parking citywide, and particularly in the downtown district. And so there's not very many things in city planning terms that San Francisco is the best at, but one thing that I would argue that San Francisco is the best at is parking through the SF Park program. And if you are interested in the parking topic, go to sfpark, as in San Francisco Park.org. and go to the document section, and there is a summary document there of the experimentation that San Francisco has been doing, applying these techniques in different ways and measuring the results, as well as all of their strategies for expanding the program in order to achieve specific outcomes related to congestion management, transit speed and reliability, economic vitality, very importantly. They're measuring retail sales quite carefully in both the experiment and control districts, and a variety of other factors. But getting back to congestion pricing, yes, of course, we need to price our roadways. Historically, we've also been reluctant to price our roadways because of the very high transactional cost that, gates that come down and person you have to hand dollar bills to. Of course, that's also, that's, 1880s technology. Even though that's how most roadways are still priced in the United States. The Golden Gate Bridge is a more recent exception where the toll booths have been eliminated from the Golden Gate Bridge and people pay through their license plate. So very effective way of having pricing be seamless. One of the things that we find, for example, with parking pricing is that, people have no problem paying $3.50 for a coffee, but object to paying a quarter for parking, even though the parking space is obviously worth a lot more money than a cup of coffee. And they object not because of the actual fee, but because the transactional cost is a lot higher than the actual cost. As we start removing the transactional cost, the hassle factor of charging, it just becomes sort of a, part of the cost of doing business. It's why all of the utilities love Autopia. If you don't have to write a check for something, it becomes invisible. Parking meters that accept credit cards, it becomes another sort of invisible thing that, you do, like your cell phone bill, my outrageously expensive cell phone bill that I just accept $250 a month, but I object to paying, $5 for parking. Providing me with cell phone service is a lot cheaper than providing me with parking. And yet, I still, even as somebody who studies this, am bothered by it because of the transactional aspect of it. But if that goes away, if I'm just charged for the service, then, whatever. Yeah.
This kind of gets back to the Stephanie's if you had 2 minutes with the mayor thing,
Okay.
but writ a bit larger, which is any of the number of the points you made would seem eminently sensible and sort of in the no shit department. They don't happen, however. And I'm curious, I know there is absolutely no one size fits all, but there were various processes about how people try to get at the sort of changes. There's the visioning approach where you have a whole bunch of people and you do a lot of kumbaya, and sometimes it's directed, sometimes it's very effective. You can also have the top-down model. Is there anything that you've seen, especially in a city such as Boston, which has got some very institutionalized ways, though with a very changing demographic?
Right.
If the mayor were to come to you and say, okay, how do we get people really talking about your theme, which is what is it you want your transportation to do? If there were a one-size-fits-all, what is it?
To translate each of those goals into quantifiable objectives. Exactly what is it that you can do in order to meet the goal, and make sure that those objectives are measurable. They can be qualitative, absolutely. They can be about perception, no problem. In fact, perceptive objectives are critically important. But you want to make sure that they're crafted in a way where you can collect data about the degree to which that objective has been met. So the next thing after you establish objectives is to determine exactly what your performance metrics are. Those performance metrics need to be the shortest list of metrics that get to the core issues. Those metrics need to be as rooted as they possibly can be in existing data, in stuff that you're already collecting. If it requires new data collection, it's, that's a big push for your city bureaucrats to actually go and collect new data. So only require the collection of new data for stuff that is super critical and totally missing. And your metrics need to be understandable. Your citizens and your elected officials need to be understand how that data that you're collecting relates to the larger objective, how that relates to the larger goal, and how it's helping me achieve the vision of the city that I've got. Oftentimes, as planners, we neglect the last step. We stop at kind of objectives, or for many of us, we stop at sort of vision and goals and don't even get into objectives. You can't complain that your traffic engineer is doing the wrong thing if your traffic engineer is doing exactly what the objectives and performance metrics you've established are telling them to do. And that is the case in almost every single city. You need to change the objectives and especially the performance metrics. Once you start doing that, you start changing the DNA of the city. Right now, if you want to do something good, you're fighting against an establishment that is telling everyone to do something that's not good. And good only happens as a result of an extremely politically contentious and technically onerous political process. Make the good thing the thing that occurs by default. That's the number one thing. And the number two thing, once you start doing that, is report back. This is something that, again, another one of the reasons why I've highlighted the work from the New York City Department of Transportation is they've been so good about this, about collecting the data, like, describing, like, what are we trying to achieve, collecting the data, but very importantly, reporting back consistently. Look, you told us you wanted this, and we've delivered. Yep, you're complaining about we've, added 3 seconds of delay, but look, we've increased retail sales by 57%. 3 seconds of delay, you tell me, what do you want? 3 second delay or, this huge increase in retail sales. So by providing the outcomes in context, you allow citizens to weigh the necessary trade-offs that we all have to face as planners and as engineers. You force citizens to deal with those necessary trade-offs. Right now, the technocrats and the politicians get complaints about single issues, and people don't understand how forcing that single issue may have profound unintended negative consequences in other arenas. That widening the street may result in less retail sales, that widening the street may result in children dying. People don't think about that, but when you're reporting back, consistently re-emphasizes how your efforts are building to the larger vision. It calms people down, and it gives courageous politicians firm ground to stand upon.
I want to thank Jeff for coming tonight, and also to just say that this series began about a month ago with really an overview of our situation right now, our current status, and I think Jeff has done a phenomenal job of giving us I won't say a roadmap, actually, more like a bike path or a sidewalk for what is the plan that we can be looking at for the future. And the next several series that we have as we continue on are going to look at some of the issues a little bit more in depth. So we will be getting down and looking at the issues of social equity, and that is on December 17th. We'll be hearing from John Powell from the Haas Diversity Research Center at UC Berkeley, followed by Helly Soholt on January 23rd, who will be here. She's a principal and founder at Gell Architects. And she will be talking about bikes and pedestrian and transit systems in Copenhagen. And also looking at, later on, we'll be looking at issues of technology and what are some of the latest technological advances in transportation, followed by, as we get into the spring, more specific case studies looking at New York, Denver, San Francisco, and several other cities that we can learn from. So that we hope that you will be sharing this with your friends and colleagues, and that we hope to continue this focus. I want to thank again the Barr Foundation for their support and remind you of a couple other pieces that are going to be coming up. Next week is ABX, the Architectural Boston Expo, which is the largest regional convention, design and construction convention, which touches upon many of the same issues around sustainable communities, and there is a full series of sessions there. On December 5th, we have an exhibition that will be opening here on transportation, and we hope that you'll be joining us. That will be running from December 5th through May of next year. I forget the exact close date, so you got a little bit of time between December 5th and May. And so we hope to see you back again as we focus on this series. Thank you again, Jeff.